then, because we're going to start the proceedings. It's raining outside. So I'd like us to just immediately then jump into the session in the interest of time, and everybody else that is currently joining the webinar. Much respect to you guys. We've got esteemed guests joining us today to discuss one of the most pivotal things that at this point in time, from a policy perspective, really is critical, and it's going to be interesting to hear some thoughts from our guests tonight. My name is Octavius. We've been running a lot of this GW related events this past week, and yeah, this is probably the last one. This is a very important one. I play the role of the entrepreneur in residence at the I'm an Accelerator. I also am the acting Accelerator manager, run my own firm as well. But tonight is less about the work that we do, really just to more focus on this topic around the Startup Act in South Africa. Right, we have on the line in part of our panelists, Modjadji Seabi from Trust. She's the head of program management and research there. We are also joined by Mashudu. Modau. You guys all know Mash. He's the founder of Lucha and publisher of Founder Source. We also have Nkululeko NK, as well as Polo, the founder and the chairman of IDF Capital. Polo, I got that right, eh? Chairman, not chairman, yeah. Chairman, right? Great. So let's start. So we've got the Startup Act having kind of started in Tunisia, in Senegal. We are seeing a lot of countries that are now having this conversation whether in their legislative framework they should introduce Startup Act. We have seen Kenya issuing a draft bill. We know that Ghana is contemplating or is also considering Startup Act. A few other countries are more likely to come through on this. So I just want to really start this session by asking directly, Polo, do you think we need Startup Act in South Africa, and why do you think so? If you don't think so, why do you not think so?
Thanks, OP, and good afternoon to everyone. So I mean, legislation is meant to be developed in response to, I suppose, a problem in the market, right? And it's meant to provide an enabling framework for certain societal objectives to be met. I think that's the first thing that we need to remember. So when the question around regulation, coming up with the Startup Act arose, the question I had in my mind, and I remain having in my mind, is what problem are we trying to solve with this legislation, OP? When you look at the legislative landscape in South Africa, in particular relating to business, whether it is around supporting entrepreneurs or SMEs, whether it is around providing incentives of one form or the other, whether it is having an institutional framework, in the form of, institutions that actually implement the legislation, including tax incentives as well, over and above other business support incentives. I struggle to justify in my mind why another piece of legislation would be required when we've got all these myriad pieces of legislation in place. And in fact, South Africa, I think, has probably got one of the most robust legislative frameworks, compared to other countries on the continent. Now, my suspicion is that whilst we've got good pieces of legislation, we are not seeing the proper implementation thereof. And as a result, we do not see the problems that these pieces of legislation we're trying to solve actually being solved. So my argument really would be that the problem of legislation not being implemented and therefore us not seeing the benefits thereof does not require another piece of legislation to solve those problems. If anything, we're going to increase the red tape. We're increasing the number of boxes, in my view, that need to be ticked. And I think it just increases the regulatory burden. That's my personal view. I think on observation, my very strong sense is that we need a somewhat different approach where we rather look at how do we harness an ecosystem where one intervention feeds onto another intervention, where you've got an ecosystem approach using the current legislative framework, but ensuring that from an implementation perspective, firstly, we are talking to each other, right, which we are not. And secondly, and probably very importantly, that we put in the necessary resources, whether it is people resources, whether it is financial resources, whether it is R&D and all those other things,
yeah.
And really just implement. For me, I think it's an implementation matter that we are dealing with, OP. I'll leave it there for now.
Oh, great. Thanks, Polo. If you're listening in, let's keep the conversation. There is a Q&A. Please put in your questions as well in the Q&A section. Let's keep the conversation also going on Twitter, anywhere or other platforms that you've got. Hashtag I'm in debate. Now, NK, you've heard what Polo's argument is that there's already legislation in the ecosystem. What we should be opting for, looking for, considering is or questioning should be around implementation. How do we get to implementation? Why would we need to introduce anything that would increase the regulatory burden, that will increase the red tape? Why not explore ways to really harness the ecosystem, either through implementation or understanding what the shortcomings of the existing legislation? You have traveled all over Africa. You took a combination of buses and taxis and train. I don't know whether you took the train, NK, in between your trekking from Cape to Cairo. What has been your observation from that end? Just listening to what Polo's argument is. What has been your observation? What's your take? Do we need the Startup Act in South Africa? Why, if not, why as well?
Cool. So I think having that sense of exposure a couple of years ago has lent the idea that SA's borders are too small to transact, especially when we start looking at scale-ups and when we start speaking about scale as a startup. You need to move past borders. And when you start interrogating that aspect, you understand that certain countries' laws are not homogeneous. This is why trade and commuting across the continent is equally very difficult. Now, when we start looking at things like an act, I think it speaks to the idea of very specific needs, in which case, in this instance, it's more of how does a large or medium-sized enterprise, how do they are sort of strong-armed to participating or introducing smaller startups and smaller businesses in their value chains. I mean, if you start looking at the case of Senegal and Tunisia, it was really a ploy to really sort of start looking at capital gains tax. It was really looking at sort of investment promotion aspects and really holding big business to account. However, what the Startup Act really didn't articulate on very clearly are the direct incentives for the startups. So, for example, one which is more notable was the idea of actual giving some sort of tax breaks and certain tax incentives for smaller startups. Now, what that essentially speaks to was then it looks at the decrease of sort of taxable income that a certain government might then traditionally get from a startup per se. Now, when you start looking at the sheer sizes of the startup acts, especially being piloted in spaces like Tunisia, Kenya, and Senegal, you start looking at the market mix that they have and the offerings that they have, and you realize that the reason why they pushed it out into the market was to create access so that they could trade cross-border and really sort of bring incentives for a very distributed market to trade. Now, in SA's instance, we've got a very complex market set, right? So we've still got a large bulk of the space essentially being owned by medium-sized enterprises. And if you start looking at the incentives that they have versus startups, you really find that, you know, the medium-sized enterprises have got a sort of bigger incentives to trade. Whereas when you start looking at the smaller startups, it becomes very difficult to sort of create an enabling environment in the way of giving larger corporates incentives to work with them. And I mean, you see this across the board. I mean, the moment you move across into another African state, you now are able to trade in dollars, right? And that speaks to the idea of access to other markets. Whereas in SA's case, dollars aren't traded on our streets. And so that speaks to our currency sovereignty. And then that sort of now lends itself to another bag to say, if we're talking about a Startup Act and those incentives, are we trying to do an investment promotion exercise where we're encouraging small startups to gain access to markets outside of SA's borders, or access to networks in ability to trade, and access to a new customer base? I mean, we start looking at the idea of Section 12J companies and sort of what has happened through that aspect of trying to incentivize people to invest all in already sort of startup geared environments. We start looking at, you know, another thing called BEE, for example, in our country, where when you actually do a request for quote, everything is reduced down to price. It's either 80-20 or 90-10. Yeah. So then, is it another piece of legislator that will then become inefficient and will not serve its purpose? So I like to lean in the direction of Polo in this regard, to say we would rather strengthen what.
Okay, great. We lost you there for like 5 seconds towards your end of the end of your opening statement. NK, but you're making, you know, incredibly valid points here, in the sense that the you know, the startup acts that were initiated, were started, were you know, enacted in countries like Tunisia and Senegal and what have you. The intention there was to broaden access, right? Provide these fiscal incentives to both the investor and the entrepreneur, right? Open up, or, you know, opportunities of trade, right? Expand what that looks like, right? And you could achieve that by lowering the tax requirements on the side of the entrepreneurs, right? And I don't want to get into this, you know, this academic debate of, you know, do we need to get to a point where we define what is a startup compared to a small businesses and what that looks like, right? So great point that you're making in here. You know, Modjadji, funny, you know, we've got rain all over Gauteng. Modjadji, the mother of rainmaking. So welcome to the session. You've been part of research, and you've been very closely, you know, or involved in how policy can be defined. In your view, in your experience, we agree that small businesses and fundamentally startups are the ones that are going to really, you know, grow our economy. In what ways can you do this better? You know, you've heard what Enki is saying, you've heard what Polo has said. Outside of the fact that, you know, whether we need it or not, do you think a legislative framework is really going to help us get better outcomes or better performance of startups or entrepreneurs in this country?
Thank you, Octavius. Yeah, I mean, yesterday when I was thinking about my contribution to this debate, I was not for the act. And, but like I said earlier on before we started, that I'm not necessarily against having a legislation because it streamlines focus and commitment. And in our case, as South Africa, where we know we have got good legislation, but implementation is either poor or at a snail pace. It may work for us to have an act, yeah, as long as the ultimate implementation tool is a national strategy that everybody contributes to. I have worked at the National Tourism Department, where I led the development of the National Tourism Sector Strategy, which was the first of the country. I think it's a good document. It was well contributed to by the private sector, specifically the tourism sector. And it gives comprehensive information in terms of the baseline. Where are we starting from in tourism at all levels, be it informal, domestic, township tourism and so on. And also it gives you the targets that a country could look at if it wants to make revenue from that sector. And it's long-term, short-term, medium-term. But you have everybody's role clearly outlined. But that national strategy is based on an act. So there's a mother instrument that guides the collective effort of how we're going to make this sector work. So I think an act for the startup could work because it will consolidate all provisions in wherever business is articulated or socioeconomic development aspiration of this country is provided for. But also it will begin to indicate which structures need to work in collaboration and not in silos. I was earlier looking at the Kenya startup bill, that it links things like the National Research Fund of that country. It links with the Science and Technology departments. It links with all initiatives where startups can be factored in. So a strategy, an act would help in terms of consolidating efforts, but also giving a high level national vision of where we want to go. But I will support that if it will come up with a well consulted strategy, because if we don't have a strategy that is approved by cabinet, that is signed off by all role players, including private sector, then the startups landscape won't mature in the way that we prefer. An example is, although it's not startup, but you know that the Department of Labor has a program of people who are unemployed registering, but we don't know how much of that database is helping unemployed, especially young people, get access to sustainable long-term jobs. So whatever system that comes into place, it needs to be thought through. And if you look at the Tunisia Act, I couldn't read it, I downloaded it, but it's in Arabic. Dando shared with me some brief outline of what it means. You would see the role players behind that act, a whole lot of private sector. It's even funded by the World Bank, some of initiatives. So it's gonna take a whole lot, but importantly is having a strategy, but also linking up with critical things like research, for example. I, for example, contributed to the establishment of the South African Conventions Bureau, which invites meetings to South Africa so that you have tourists. But it's also based on strategies, based on legislation. Everything else flows from the umbrella thought kind of policy setup, but it has to cascade down to operational tool. Yeah.
Cool. No, fantastic. Thanks so much for that, Mthembu. So Mesh, I want to bring into this conversation, right? I consider you the total sum of young entrepreneurs in South Africa, right? By just the nature of the work that you do and the community that you've built around you, right? So, and sorry to put you under pressure, but it almost feels like if, whatever views that you're gonna have, there's a high likelihood that they will represent 8 out of 10 young entrepreneurs across the country, right? The bill in Tunisia,
am I the only one who can't see OP?
Yes,
he's frozen.
Am I frozen?
You were frozen.
Yes, you were.
You were just talking about the bill in Tunisia, so you can
Yeah,
kick.
so both the bills in Tunisia were from the ground up, right? Started by the entrepreneurs. In some were started as a policy hackathon where entrepreneurs sat together and said, guys, let's creatively come up with what is going to assist us in enriching the experience or, of really starting high-risk businesses. And I think that's how it kind of started. Your view, you've heard how, on one side, people is saying, we already have some of the, frameworks in place, just to execute. NK is saying, you know what, there's a lot more to what this thing should be doing around incentives and everything else, right? Mthembu is saying it also informs the high level plan and the, the strategy and everything else, but it must be compensated or accompanied by, operational tools. You are the entrepreneur, you work with entrepreneurs. One, is the Startup Act even necessary in your view? What will it change? Do you think it is important? How should you go about to do it better as Africa?
Yeah, so I think I'm really informed by the experiences that entrepreneurs share with me, but also my own experience as an entrepreneur. And my experience is that we have a very fragmented ecosystem with a lot of polarizing experiences for people, right? So if you asked 5 entrepreneurs what they experience is of going through the South African startup ecosystem in terms of development or support, you'd get 5 very different answers, right? And each of them would have completely different experiences, how they went into the ecosystem, where they started, and what the impact was that they actually got from the organizations that they work with. And because of that reality, I think something like this, if it becomes a framework that tries to standardize or at some level, equalize the playing field so that people can have much better experiences, be enabled at a much better pace, empowered at a much better level. If it really goes into helping entrepreneurs be able to navigate the ecosystem and the ecosystem being held accountable for how it enables entrepreneurs, and it not just being a tick boxing exercise and just like, okay, we just want you to tell us how many people went to your event, but like, what was the impact that you were driving, and like, what happened to the entrepreneurs that you say that you helped? Because getting someone in the room is great, but what does that actually mean, and what does the impact actually look like? So I think if this can be the sort of thing that helps drive much better ecosystem to be built that is really collaborating in a meaningful and impactful way to really drive impact, to empower and enable entrepreneurs to be able to build the best startups. I think the thing that I really care about is whether or not this will have a massive impact on making our ecosystem work better for entrepreneurs. Because I think right now, the ecosystem is way more beneficial to the people that are saying they develop entrepreneurs. Those people are the ones that are really the ones that are benefiting the most from the ecosystem and the money that goes into the ecosystem. But how do we change that sort of paradigm and that situation to become, okay, how does this actually impact entrepreneurs? How does the ecosystem now cater for and focus on driving impact for entrepreneurs? And what does that look like? So really involving the entrepreneurs throughout the process of building this out, whether or not it's a framework or it's an act, or just better execution of the ones that exist, it really needs to include entrepreneurs a lot more. I think the biggest thing that I've seen in really great ecosystems is the participation of entrepreneurs and startups that have succeeded or considered to have made it. Those guys go back and they constantly plowing back, whether it's an entrepreneur that sells their business and now they have some money and now they become a VC, they become an angel investor, they go back into the ecosystem and they plow back, they try and find a way to add value again. We need a lot more of that sort of relationship where you're getting a lot more entrepreneurs getting involved in stuff like this and contributing meaningfully to shaping these things, whether it's from the formation of them or from the execution of it as well. OP, you are muted.
I was making sure that the audio is crisp when Mashudu is speaking. You're making great points, right? You're making great points. I completely agree. I agree with you. I particularly am interested in seeing how.
OP's connectivity is not great, eh?
Unfortunately not.
Let's just have a conversation about the house. So, I'm not getting part of this conversation.
Oh, now he's back.
Okay, we were just gonna go ahead. Okay, we can't hear you.
Yeah. I mean, and that time I'm the one who's actually at the office making sure that there is no interruption to the connection. And you guys are all from home and you are doing much better than, it's a sign. I should have gone home and done this thing from home.
Absolutely.
I apologize. But what I was really just asking Mesh is that how do entrepreneurs participate? You know, most of us talk about how we must be included, but do we come to the party? And if we're coming to the party, what is our offer? In a matter like this, what would be our proposition in your view? One, how do we get involved? How do we get, you know, entrepreneurs to see that this kind of discussions, they must be at the center of it and lead it? And what would be our proposition on a matter like this?
It's really interesting. I think there's two parts to this, right? So the first part would be, okay, are entrepreneurs the ones that must drive this, right? Or should they be invited to the table for this? And I think in ecosystems where really incredible things happen, entrepreneurs should be driving this, right? So entrepreneurs should be the ones talking about whether or not this needs to exist. Entrepreneurs should be the ones going, okay, how do we make this work the best way? I think more often than not, South African entrepreneurs specifically, we wait for someone else to sort of figure out something out for us, and then we hope to just be included in the final process. But by the time you speak to sort of different communities in entrepreneurship, and you know, you've already got the bill formed or whatever it is, and you're just asking for their opinion, it's too late, right? So you've already formulated what this should be and how it should work. And I think a big part of this would need to be that entrepreneurs start to step up and say, you know what, my role as an entrepreneur is also to be an ecosystem stakeholder in some way, like an ecosystem player, right? So for example, I consider myself as an ecosystem player, right? So I consciously start to look at how can I join conversations around the things that people should be doing to help entrepreneurs, how those entrepreneurs can actually be empowered better, and how entrepreneurs can be included in the processes of developing the best resources or the tools that they actually need. We need more entrepreneurs going, you know what, yes, I'm building my business and it's really, really important that I do this, but you also have a responsibility to also take part and participate and consciously and intentionally be in the conversation, be in the room for the conversation, be in the email chain for whatever is happening. Just be there and actively participate in shaping what the ecosystem becomes and where it actually goes. Because I think where the ecosystem is now will always be where it is unless we consciously and intentionally try and shape a new reality.
Yeah, great, man. Thank you for that. Polo, I want to bring you to this conversation. One, in your right, you are an entrepreneur, right? You started IDF fresh from leading one of the most critical legislative frameworks in this country. You led the the writing of the BEE legislation. Went on to start your own business. You're the first private equity firm, I think at the time by Black women. You've been building IDF Capital, but at the anchor of IDF Capital is to support entrepreneurs. So while you're an entrepreneur, you also help in developing entrepreneurs. Now the conversation now is that you believe, one, the legislative framework has not been fully expanded, or we haven't executed it in detail. Let's do that. But you're also hearing now what Mesh is saying, that listen, we have challenges. We even Google ourselves has pointed out to this. So how do we make use of the legislative framework that currently exists to the advantage of the entrepreneurs that you yourself invest in? How do you simplify the entrepreneur's life or experiences? How do we enhance it to Mesh's point, so that when you are investing, you're investing in entrepreneurs that are being appreciated by the ecosystem? How do you do that?
Well, it's a tough question, OP, and there's so much I really want to talk about. So before I answer your question, I'm actually going to ask us to think about this a little bit differently. So when you look at countries that have done this startup thing well, I'll use Israel as a practical example. They were at a particular point in their economic development journey, right? They were a fairly young nation. And they probably, like everybody else, had some legislation in place around R&D and things like that. But the government of the day understood that, they understand the concept of what I call social engineering. Social engineering requires of you to be proactive and deliberate in driving certain activity which will lead to certain outcomes, right? Yeah. So we need to understand that, and I can never overemphasize this, I always say apartheid was a very successful piece of legislation because it hampered our creativity, it hampered our ability to amass collateral wealth and all those other things. It stifled us, right? Where we, in the main, were trained to be workers, right? Yeah. So you are coming from a society that is trying to overcome that history that is engraved in us, right? Even though some of us were lucky that when we became adults, apartheid was over, but we come from families, because remember that it's a culture thing as well. Culturally, we have observed that our parents work for big corporate or they work as domestic workers and whatever. And therefore, our ambitions are informed by our socialization and exposure. So it is important to understand the context of where we are and the context of where, say, an Israeli was. And in realizing where they were as a nation, plus, of course, the existential crisis situation, government not only came up with legislation, they actually put behind that legislation, you know, they injected it, they put money in, they had a challenge fund. They said, here is the $80 million in the early 90s. We will match, if you can go and raise, we will match whatever you raise, right? What that did is it fueled an interest in the startup space. So we need to understand that. Now, when you come back home and say, so what are we doing in South Africa to fuel that? Yes, we've come up with great legislation. I think we've got some of the best legislation in the world. And we've come up with institutions, right? But have we gone out over and above that and being deliberate in driving? So, Polo, here's the Small Business Act, or here is this tax incentive or whatever. Is it in my face? Is there a deliberate effort on the part of the powers that be to make sure that Polo actually knows that it is okay for her to leave her cushy Standard Bank job and go and take advantage of this opportunity, because there are all these cushions, there are all these incentives. And then once Polo has done it, then other Polos will jump out and say, oh, wow, okay, we can see how this whole thing is supporting him. So that's why I'm making a very strong case, OP, for a more ecosystem approach, a more deliberate interventionist approach. And when I say interventionist, I'm really talking about, if we're saying TIA is there to promote innovation, research, and development, how many South Africans know this? Do we even profile it? If you don't live in Johannesburg or Pretoria, do you even understand that TIA exists? How does the existence of TIA benefit me when I live in KZN? Is there another TIA in KZN? Do I understand what it means? What does it practically mean? So I think that we have not done that work. So there's a market, there is, there are all these resources, right? But there's nobody who's come in and integrated all of that. And that's why our approach is fragmented. It's not, it's not integrated, and that's why we're not seeing the benefits. So I would strongly, and I like what Modjadji said, and maybe this is what is lacking. I would strongly advocate for there to be almost like an innovation or startup, whatever you want to call it, not so much new law, but maybe strategy. So you need political leadership that says, we want to be a leading 4IR nation, which is what our president has been saying, right? And driving that, and this is what the former president Thabo Mbeki did very well, by the way, when they came up with the BE legislation, he provided the political leadership, and he would go out and talk about this is what we're doing on BE and that and that and the other, and that's why we saw the progression in BE that we did during his time, because he was vocal about it, you know, and he pushed for it. Similarly, if you are going to say that as a country we have to be leading when it comes to the fourth industrial revolution or innovation or small business or whatever, you have to then also follow it with the political leadership, but also making sure that we have got almost champions, if you will, in the market that are then saying, Polo, this is what 4IR means for you, and this is how you can upskill yourself. Because right now we're talking about 4IR. South Africans don't have digital skills, basic digital skills, let alone a very deep technical digital skills. So are we then following? Are we then talking to the Skills Development Act to say, how does the Skills Development Act then ensure that we drive the building of digital skills so that this 4IR can become a reality? I have not heard that conversation. And if it is being had, it is being had by people in probably big offices and speaking big English, and not talking to the people who are actually supposed to be the people who benefit from this thing. So I know it's a mouthful, but I just feel, yeah, we just need to get on with it, and we need to have the right people, and we need to be seen to be doing the right things, and not just saying them, but also seen to be doing them. Then we're going to start driving what it is that we are saying this legislation should be achieving.
Oh, so here's the thought. Thanks so much, Polo, for that. And you're introducing, a kind of a different perspective. NK, and the thought is, well, you know what? Maybe what we really just need is a strategy, right? Strategy that will get us to execute, and we'll pull all these resources that are available, find a way that we could explore the power that which we have with our legislative framework and everything else. Do we see that happening? Is that if we look at the intersection of innovation, finance, research, and policy, do you think we've got all the ingredients to allow us to put together a strategy that we could execute, spearheaded, of course, by government and everybody else involved? Strategy, as opposed to a startup act. Would that work? What are your thoughts?
So I think in answering that question, the fundamental question that's always one needs to ask is, so what?
Yeah.
And then and what? And which I know, like, they are your two favorite questions, those, OP. And when we start, when we start looking at strategy, right? I see a lovely word here. It's called the theory of change. And when we start looking at that, we also understand that many aspects of civil society, government, academia, the quadruple helix model is very fragmented. And even with that sort of alignment is not there within even those organizations. And so when we start talking strategy, we can't not talk about the homogeneous structures and how they blend and they sort of gel together and create these enabling opportunities to really lend themselves around landing these ideas. So, for example, we always chuckle around this idea of who are we serving? Are we and who stands to be the biggest beneficiary of said Startup Act? Is it corporate? Is it the CSOs? Who is it? And more often than not, you'll find that it's not the startup itself.
Yeah.
And it's merely to incentivize certain ways that business processes are currently happening. And this is where the balance or the shift of scales and the balance of powers needs to. And that is, in answering that shift is where we'll find the strategy to unlock the real enabling aspect of startups and their ability to survive.
Okay, we lost you there. Okay, all right, great points there. So which then leads me to this. If we then want to talk about the the maximization of the different resources that are currently in the market, owing to the failures and who's experiencing these failures. And then you are saying we have the strategy. And Ms. Seabi, you started also this conversation, this idea of and we've heard what the entrepreneurs are saying. The entrepreneurs are saying, listen, the ecosystem is not saving us. The ecosystem is literally broken. The people that are benefiting from the ecosystem are not the entrepreneurs. We are hearing from Polo and as another ecosystem players that maybe what we really just need is execution. Let's find ways in which we can make this simple, right? In what ways, in your experience, we simplify this thing to the benefit of the entrepreneur?
Yeah, I think Mashudu has said it, that ideally the leadership of this, if I may call it, intervention should be led by the startups themselves, because then if it fails, it means they're failing their sector. However, without a common direction, which is normally espoused in a strategy, there would not be sort of a common goal, common direction to achieving something with a big impact. So, and I agree that it should be led by and large by the startups. However, it needs to be a national document. It needs to be a policy document that both the private sector and government sort of sign or agree to, which normally is done in a cabinet approval of a national strategy. Because then a strategy allows clarity on who is going to lead what, who's going to benefit from what, and who is going to fund what. So it gives guidance in terms of structural arrangement of making sure that the intervention towards supporting startups work. We know very well we need the startups contribution, because the startups will contribute to economic growth, will contribute to socio-economic development of people. They also contribute to formalization of the informal sectors, which are all over around in our country. And hence, we don't feel the impact of the participation of startups because they are fragmented, they're everywhere, they're not organized, not by their own choice, but by the system, by also the inability to get the necessary support that should be given by those who have muscles, whether it's private sector or government. And therefore it is important for having that. And but also it helps to have, the strategy helps to have time frame, because we normally hear people complain that we are in the 25th or 26th years of democracy, but it feels like we have never really been emancipated, or we are not now in a free state, freedom state or so. So if there's no common goal that we're all working towards, I mean, you may lose hope in getting a strategy, but I strongly feel that if it's well crafted, led by the beneficiaries themselves, which is the startups, with a buy-in, like Sispul was saying, by political leadership. And I'm sure at the current moment we have the political head who has interest and would buy into a startup strategy developed by startups, entrepreneurs, and so on and so on. And this is the time, and it's not going to be easily dismantled if it doesn't come back to power in the next 2 years or 3 years, because the strategy has a long life, and also it's not dependent on government. It's it depended on a whole lot of strategic or of role players who have vested interest there. And yes, therefore, like Sispolo say, it needs socialization. It needs to be talked to, and so that people know. And also it helps, the strategy will help to ensure that there's follow through, you know. I attended away to as in the incubation, you know, to start piggery, but I didn't end up anyway. I mean, I attended, I got good information on how to draw business plan and so on. But if you're in that dire situation of wanting to make something out of a small thing that you have, and the system and the process doesn't allow you a follow through to an extent that you really begin to start and become an emerging business person, you're doomed to stop somewhere, and a few will succeed in that incubation. So hence you need a comprehensive document or strategy that is developed by the beneficiaries who know that the ultimate goal is to grow and then give back, you know.
All right, great. Thanks so much, Ms. Seabi. I want to just quickly tap on some of the questions that have been asked here. There's a lot of activity in the chat room. Jalal, director from Alan Grey's Foundation, has been very vocal in there. We also have McLean Sibanda as well joining us and really just talking to the Technology Innovation Agency Act. Not sure how many people are aware of that. There's a question that he has, but I want to start with Zandile's question, which is there a common knowledge or a common understanding, or can we all agree on what is a startup? And if not, whose responsibility is it to define, you know, that before we get into the act or the strategy? Mashudu, your thoughts. Do we have a common understanding? And I'm picking on you because you've asked this question before on your Twitter timeline, or mentioned that startup is not a small business. Do we have a common understanding? And if not, who must define it? And what is a startup in your view?
It's so interesting. You asked that question and Polo started smiling. I think she should actually answer.
Take a first bite. Take a first bite. She'll come with you. Take a first bite.
So number one. So number one, I would definitely say we don't have a common understanding, right? It's a term that we use interchangeably in South Africa, where we just refer to anyone that is starting a business as a startup. It doesn't matter what that business does, whether they sell veggies or socks, or they're building a high-tech solution to, you know, shift how home affairs works. It doesn't matter. Like, we just think that if someone is starting a business, they must be a startup. And you know, it's very interesting. For me, that is not what I believe, right? There's a traditional small business and a startup. The reason for which that business exists is usually what defines what it is. So for me, high growth, usually tech enabled or tech focused, usually have very different metrics, very different focus. The way they are built is different. The way they operate is different. I think there is a need to define it. I'm not sure who needs to be the person that says, hey guys, you're talking about the very different things here. Like, you're talking about something that is completely unrelated, right? And I think the day that I posted this on Twitter, I remember getting attacked and people said, no, you are wrong. Startups, you know, are everyone. Anyone can be a startup. Even if you sell veggies, you are a startup. I said, okay. I'm choosing to recuse myself from this conversation because it's a difficult dialogue to have with people, because I don't know if it's media or what it is, but we just decided that, look, if you are starting a business, you are a startup. Whether or not it's about being scalable, you know, whether it's about all these different things, no. As long as you are starting a business, you are a startup. And I think it's very, very misguided, because they are completely different things between a small business and a startup. And I think it's so important that we have that conversation, but also that someone actually starts to educate, especially media. I think this really comes from media side, where media just said startup and everyone said, okay, everything is a startup. And when you think about whether or not the language is now also a barrier to how people actually get assistance. You know, when someone says, hey, we're looking for startups to fund, and you sell socks, and you go there and you say, hey, I sell socks, I need the money. And they say, but you're not a startup. And you go, but I am.
I love this. I love this so much, because we actually were having this debate just yesterday in the office. And even in my own team, we are having a big fight about, what is a startup? But I think for me, it really underlines the comment I started off with, which is to say, what problem are we trying to solve with the Startup Act, right? Because do we even understand what we are talking about? And until we answer that question, OP, it becomes very, very difficult to then answer the question, until we answer the question that Zandile is asking. So Zandile, thank you for your question, because it's probably the most important question. Until we answer that question, we actually cannot answer the question intelligently of whether we actually need a Startup Act, or we need just a strategy which pulls everything together. Now, the reason why my sense is that we don't need a Startup Act is because we've got pieces of legislation that deal with different types of businesses and different stages of businesses, if you will, right? So you've got the Small Business Corporation provisions in the Income Tax Act, which say that if your turnover is less than whatever, you will not get taxed, as an example, right? Now, it doesn't care whether you call yourself a startup or an SME. It's just there and you can use it, right? You've got, I was using an example of TIA, which is there to help, commercialize what maybe Mashudu would argue are startups, right? Now, if you've got, and I think it is informed by a piece of legislation which is meant to drive innovation, R&D and innovation and the commercialization thereof. So the reason why I argue that we've got different pieces of legislation that address different businesses, business types, level of development or stage of development. What the strategy that Modjadji is proposing, and which is what maybe I would support, what it would do is it would say, firstly, assuming that Mashudu's definition of a startup is a high growth business that is driven in the main by technology. Let's assume that we accept that as a definition. Then what it then does is it then says, because we're looking at high growth businesses that require R&D, innovation, whatever, these are the different pieces of legislation that are in place. Let's bring them into the strategy and then talk about how then do we operationalize them. So-and-so is going to make sure that this piece of legislation works. Then when they are done, you graduate from them to this one. And so that's what for me a strategy would do, because it's the how of it. But the legislation, I'm not sure, but it's the how. And until we agreed on what is a startup, we cannot define the problem intelligently enough, and therefore the solution may actually not be appropriate as a result of inadequate thinking around what it is that we're trying to solve as a problem.
NK, your view. You are more than also welcome to take the bite or take this offer of defining and taking a shot at what is a startup according to you. But I want you to extend it even further. That would the definition, would defining what a startup is help us in your view?
Quite blankly, no. I say this because and I think like South Africa's addressable market is very small. Especially when we start looking at technology-enabled businesses, or rather, technology as a product or a service offering, right? It's very small, and all we need to do is look at companies like Twitter, Zoom, the platform that we're using right now, to realize that actually, if you're going to build a scalable, repeatable, and a 10x type solution, it needs to go past your borders. Now, the reality is then you then ask yourself the next question to say, if I'm going to then presume, or rather move past or scale my business or build a repeatable model, what is it called in that context where it's going to land in that country, for example? and is it relevant in that country? What is the context of that country? And you know, I suppose that in that regard, then if startup is an important word in enabling grassroots sort of innovation and development before getting to 10x, then I suppose yes, you know, call yourself a startup. But in a position where you are a business and your primary aim is to trade a product or service, you are a business. You know, whether you are big or you are small, you are fundamentally, in principle, a business. A startup, be it big or small, I mean, you can be an internet offering that doesn't have a 10x or is 1x, and you compare yourself with Google, and it still refers to itself as a startup. You know, in the way that it's mapped its growth path and it's mapped its growth tangents, etc. What's also very particularly interesting is a trend that is happening around in China, where because of its legislative environment, that you find that young businesses are actually buying older businesses, older companies that are trading on the stock exchange, and are fundamentally breaking and are building new businesses within a trading name. Typical typical example, you'll find a data warehousing business will buy a mining company, but will trade as a mining company, but at its core is fundamentally a data warehousing business. So in that regard, is it a startup, or can it still get the same incentives as a startup? And I mean, what is the principal aim of it having transacted in that exercise? And that's the fundamental need to do business. Yeah. So, you know, quite blankly, my answer is.
All right, great. Thanks, Nkululeko. You always have interesting thoughts and takes at these things. Really appreciate them. I really appreciate them. And unfortunately, guys, we can't continue with this conversation. We've only sat for an hour. The discussions in the chat room have been blowing up. McLean, Jalal, everybody else is providing their own definition of what a startup is, from to as far as Blank's definition and everything else. Great. Nontando Mteto as well, saying they agree with the alignment. You know, they feel that it is important. Karabo also saying that they said, you know what, as an entrepreneur, it is important, Mesh, that we actively participate as an ecosystem player. So great conversation. I really appreciate you guys for making the time. When I invite you, one line parting shots, starting with you, Mesh.
Yeah, so I was actually just going through the chat now, and I was about to type out that I was agreeing with Mr. McLean Sibanda, who was just saying that the difference in a SMME and a startup being, you know, the potential of scalability and the potential of the market that you're going into, and the different set of challenges that you'll go through in operating the thing that you're trying to build. So for me, it's like you take a statement like that and like a reality like that and juxtapose it against just like the reality of South Africa's ecosystem, which is like the ecosystem is built to support entrepreneurs as a blanket statement, right? And we don't necessarily start to separate or enough, hey, okay, we are focused on startups in this industry that look like this, and this is how they should work. Small businesses in this category that do this and do that and do that. And I think once we start reshaping and like better aligning the entire ecosystem to start working for entrepreneurs, then I don't think any extra thing will help change anything, right? So let's fix the ecosystem we have now. Let's align it better. Let's put everyone in the room, if that's even possible, right? To really get them to say, okay, guys, this is what we need to commit to as a collective. Incubators, accelerators, fund managers, VCs, you know, everyone, entrepreneur communities, entrepreneurs themselves. How do we make sure that we're building an ecosystem that actually empowers and enables entrepreneurs to build the things that they believe in? Because that's the only thing that really matters. Like nothing else really matters unless the entrepreneurs themselves have the best possible environment with the best tools, the best resources, the training, the insights, access to mentors, incredible just a really robust ecosystem that serves entrepreneurs. Unless we can build that, no extra piece of legislation or a new framework is really going to matter. So I really think like that's the thing that we need to really focus on, and that's the problem that we really need to focus on. And like, if that can be the thing that we fix, then we can sort of move on to going, okay, what can come next? What can be built next? What can be introduced next to try and change things or improve things for the future? But thank you guys so much for having me. I really, really appreciated this.
So much. Maybe what you need to think about is there is somebody who's benefited from the broken system. Not the conversation for today. Let's take it on the timeline. NK, your thoughts?
Man, like for me, it's just, let's just trade. You know, I think, you know, we wrap our heads so much around these tools, these devices, these nooks and crannies to sort of spot, like, and you know, so we're talking about the Startup Act right now, and you know what, in someone else's mind, it means an opportunity to create a new market. You know, let's render new services so that businesses become Startup Act compliant. You know, and then, you know, but for me, it's just the fundamental and the principal aim. For any entrepreneur listening to this call right now is to trade, and is to just trade, and just go back to the principles of access. Like, I mean, the Startup Act addresses challenges of access to markets, right, and access to networks. And what that is just picking up the phone and calling and working LinkedIn and working all these various platforms. And that's where the solution might just be, you know.
Thank you so much, NK. Ms. Seabi, your parting shots?
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, I mean, I think even though Nkululeko is not in a way wanting to support strategy, he is, and what Mashudu also said is that, you know, the fact of collective efforts and direction. For me, having a strategy will make sure what is key, making sure that those who are not in the circle of knowing or getting access to information, who are startups, who have the potential to be startups, but they don't have the socializing environment, the social engineering that Sispulu talked about, could assist with it. And therefore, for me, it's leaving no one behind and bringing those who are informal into the mainstream, because there are a lot of people who are startups who are not formalized, and they are trading, you know, but they are, and you don't want people to not grow. You know, you don't want to trade to not grow and be a subsistence farmer or hand-to-mouth entrepreneur. You know, you want people who will grow their market, and therefore maybe an initiative that brings about a strategy towards a desired future for entrepreneurs should be established. And thank you for inviting me. It was really interesting. I'm sure we'll have a second round next year also. Thank you.
Yeah, we'll definitely try and have a second. Thank you so much, Mthembu. Polo, last you know, thoughts from your end, and if I may put a challenge to you and your team at IDF, and I am in Accelerator, would you by any chance come up with what you consider to be a startup based on your experience, but also just your parting shots from today's session? Thoughts?
I'm not going to take any chances with defining startups. I will rely on Mesh on this one. But I think that, I mean, we operate in the startup space. I think that there are certain characteristics that would define a startup. There could be differences of opinion in one or two things, but certainly businesses that are potentially high growth, where there's not much certainty. I think, in fact, somebody put it in a definition here. The certainty of future opportunities is not there, but you know, if you are able to unlock the potential, then you could grow exponentially. I think that we need to do a few things, OP. I think we need to, I really feel very strongly that we need to start taking an ecosystem approach in the work that we do. And you will notice, for instance, as IDF, we started out as a pure funder, right? And we realized very quickly that the quality of pipeline, especially in the tech startup space that was coming through, was not what it should be. Now, we could have, like everybody else, decried the fact that there's no good pipeline and carried on just being a funder. But we took the decision that we will go further into the value chain and build our own accelerator, right? Because we understand what investors are looking for from tech startups, and we were not getting it. So we went and did it ourselves, and we have legislation that enables us. Now, there's no piece of legislation that I've come across in South Africa that says thou shalt set up accelerators and things like that. But when you look at the BBBE Act, when you look at various incentives that are there in government and you bring all of that together, you actually can set up an accelerator and be able to take advantage of some of the benefits of, and that's what I'm talking about, that the legislation is there. So we need to do the work of being ecosystem players, in my view. I was sharing with you, OP, that we are now launching a new initiative that is going even further in the value chain, where we've said part of the challenge of the tech startup ecosystem is that we actually don't have people with the relevant tech skills. Guess what we are now doing? We're now going further and saying we will build the tech skills ourselves, right? Not Polo, of course, Polo is just an accountant, she knows debit and credit, but we will work with experts in the field so that we can start feeding the pipeline of tech skills. Because if we are serious about, for IR, those are the things we need to be doing. We've got the skills development element of the codes that allow us to tap into the business's scorecard and say, can you drive some of your money towards helping us to build tech skills? So that's how we are doing it. And I'm not saying that's the best way of doing it, but we think we can get the best outcomes when we understand that taking an ecosystem approach is likely to get us better outcomes. So that's, I think, what we as practitioners should do, whether there's legislation or not. Then second to that, because we are subject matter experts and because we are practitioners, we can then put together what we think are is a framework, if you will, or a strategy. So I don't know who spoke, I think it was Mashudu or somebody who said, you then have your VC players, you have your incubators, you have your accelerators and all the other ecosystem players coming in and saying, we understand the challenges of these people that we're trying to help to be these, and we think that this framework, which is going to integrate everything, actually is what we need to drive a collective effort as a nation in order for us to achieve the outcomes that we achieve. And we can then go to government and say, this is what we think. We cannot wait for government to come and if we're going to wait for government to come and tell us how we should run businesses, how we should support entrepreneurs, that is the quickest way we're going to fail. But what we do in coming up with this white paper, if you will, and educating them, then we then demand of them to then provide that political leadership. But we will have given them the blueprint of what needs to be done or what needs to be true in order for us to unlock this potential that we see as a country. So it's a 2-3-pronged approach. Let's do what we need to do. Let's work with what we have. 1, 2, let's say what, from a framework perspective, if you will, I really I'm avoiding the use of legislation because I don't think we need new legislation. We just need somebody to wrap it all up nicely together. And I'll call it a strategy because that's what Modjadji wants to call it. And then thirdly, make sure that we get both political leadership, but also actually business leadership, because it's actually business, by the way, that can also drive this in a very meaningful way, because they are at the core phase of interacting with some of these startups that we are talking about.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Polo. Guys, I want to close it right here, right now. Thank you for everyone who joined. Augustine, Carla, Charlotte, Jalal, Kabelo, McLean, Nelson, Nonta, Vumani, Zandile, everybody, Andre, who jumped onto the call to really listen to this conversation. To our panelists, great show for today. Really appreciate the insights and the expertise that you shared with everyone else. We are going to put this recordings of this debate on our YouTube channel. Because it's a body of knowledge, it's a conversation that we think it is going to be very important for all the ecosystem players really to take inspiration to figure out what needs to be done to better the experiences of the entrepreneur. So with that, thank you everybody else. I wish you honor and strength. Enjoy the rest of the weekend ahead of you.
Thank you and enjoy the rain.
Cheers.
Thank you for the rain. Bye.
Bye.